right, last but definitely not least, one of our own as well, Thijs Bouman from the University of Groningen will tell us about other people's values, I believe. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to also give a talk here. Well, we already had a lot of very nice talks. So it's also a pleasure to basically sort of close it. It's not really closing it because there's a panel discussion afterwards, but sort of close the official presentations. The downside of it is that because everything relates to each other, I think what has been presented, that many of the things that I'm going to talk about have been touched upon already a little bit. So there might be some repetition. At the same time, I think there's also sort of a unique message at the end, which I think is worth sharing. But also the start of the presentation, I wasn't entirely sure about what was presented by the others beforehand. So I might have to improvise a little bit. So just a small disclaimer before I start. But what I want to talk about is actually sort of what underlies the inaction of people and also the perceptions we have of different people, focusing on values. So what has been said a couple of times already, climate action is a big problem, and the actions that we are taking lag far behind. Also, what we saw yesterday, or at least those who attended the defense of Chingan and read her dissertation, very nice dissertation, so very, I think for those who weren't there and didn't read it, I would really advise to look into the dissertation. But what actually was a recurring theme there as well is also that we sort of have the impression that people are taking way too little action. So there's not only too little actual action, it's also how we perceive others. So if you ask about people, the government, the financial sector, businesses, and, well, not NGOs, media, and residents, basically people sort of agree that they are taking too little action. And why are people taking too little action? Is an open question. Well, there's some actual data that we collected ourselves as well, together with Finn, Jens, and Virgil Koppler are not here, but it was within the Netherlands, but also there we asked, what do you think, how supportive or how engaged are different people in different types of actions in the Netherlands? And there you also see that actually the programmable actions are not that much taken, not that much supported. The green bars sort of represent those people who agree to, or indicate to what extent people think that others in the Netherlands engage in these behaviors, and you see that's basically always a minority. But why do people take too little action? Well, if you look at psychological theory, but also how people may think about these things, people often come up with ideas about, well, there's a deeper underlying reason, motivation, why people don't engage in the action. So if people don't engage in climate actions, there might be something wrong in the earlier motivational process that's going on. And maybe it might basically boil down to people might not be concerned enough about climate change, but even that people might not value these kind of topics, might not care that much about nature, the environment, might not care about society, pro-societal goals, and might mostly be mostly self-interested. So people are indeed often seen as caring little about climate change, so beliefs, but also being primarily self-interested, caring less about others, and caring less about nature compared to those self-interests. So we also have quite some data together with Jean, who's here in the room, or was in the room at least. We collected data within a large Horizon project, capable project. We had many different things in there, but one of the things we asked about is also how worried people are about climate change. And basically, the real worry, so being very worried or extremely worried, you see that many people anticipate other people in their country to be not that worried about climate change. Also, if you look at deeper values, so if I talk about values, I talk about what people find generally important in their lives, are sort of general overarching life goals. We know from the literature that particularly vice-versa values are important for climate action, which reflects caring about nature, caring about the environment, self-transcending, where altruistic values are important for climate action, which concerns helping others, caring about others, but also that there are some values that are actually quite destructive or can be quite destructive for climate action. This prioritizing self-interest, personal goals, so being rich, status, and these kind of things. And those things often inhibit people from taking climate action. And there you see quite a similar pattern to what we showed before. So earlier we saw that people don't think people are that worried about climate change, think that people don't take that many climate actions. And here you also see that it sort of boils down, or that it sort of is reflected in the values we assume other people to have. So what we see here is that we actually, many people think that others don't care that much about the environment, don't care that much about caring and helping others, and actually think that many people are self-interested. So that many people want to be rich, want to have many possessions, but also want to be respected by others and have status over others, so control over others. So if you summarize this, it seems like people act too little and hardly care about these topics. Many see people as little motivated to do something for nature, but also for society, which means maybe we need to motivate people. But I think you already mentioned it might not be the best way to address this. So quite depressing, but is it true? And if you look at the actual data, so what people actually see it themselves, you see quite big differences. So here you see that on top you see what people say, how much they worry about climate change. At the bottom you see what people, what I just presented, think others care about or where they are worried about. You see that actually quite a lot of people are quite concerned about climate change. Oh, I see Jean is sitting over there. Sorry, I didn't spot you earlier. Also, other data show basically the same pattern. So, a study by the United Nations also showed that a vast majority actually labels climate change as a global emergency. So, really a big problem that needs to be addressed now and soon. And also, if you look at values, you see quite a similar pattern. It's maybe a bit hard to see from the back, but what I just presented were the bars on the right every time. So this is how we perceive others. The bars on the left is actually what people self-report or say to care about. And you see that actually quite a lot of those values are very supportive of environmental action, but also pro-social action. So you see that actually, so those are the top bars. I made them maybe a bit confusing. I made those which are sort of supportive of environmental societal action green, and the opinions or the scores that are not supportive of those actions red. But you see that actually out people themselves, many people care a lot about nature and the environment, care a lot about helping others, caring for others. And actually those more self-interested values, so caring about being rich, having possessions, are not that much endorsed. And actually a lot of people say that's not like me at all. And the same happens for being respected by others, having status within society. So if you look at the data that people indicate themselves, what they say about themselves, you see that there's actually quite a strong value basis for pro-societal action. But how can we explain this? And I think we already tapped into some answers, or many of these answers in previous talks. One thing we didn't talk about, it might of course also be that people just lie. So it's maybe nice to present yourself as a person who cares about others, who cares about the environment. Well, I won't go into too much detail, but there is evidence that actually people are quite honest in these kind of opinions. So if you make things possible, if you enable people, you see that many people act, and there's also strong relationships between these things. A point of view where I'm more in favor, or which I think better reflects reality, is actually that we are maybe too cynical about each other. And actually that might also be one of the root causes to which I will come back, of inaction, to which I will come back in a minute. So maybe it's not that people are lying, but maybe that we perceive others as lying, as not caring about these topics, that actually inhibits us from taking action. So are we too cynical? Well, what I just mentioned, there is some evidence that actually people do care a lot about these topics, and that might actually be inhibited not by a lack of motivation or personal motivation, but a lot of other things that occur within society. One thing which hasn't been mentioned, or not that explicitly, is I think value associations, or basically how people translate those values, those things they care about, into more concrete actions. So you, for instance, maybe the most straightforward example might be the wind parks, is that for some people that might be seen as something really pro-environmental, contributing to sustainable transition, sustainable energy transition, but for others, they might see it as killing birds. So actually you might have the exact same values, but translated in a complete different opinion about a certain action. Also with, for instance, so Lu Yang is, for instance, working on that, with regard to how people perceive economic growth. Actually, a lot of people, so within the European Union, we found that 70% of the people think that economic growth is essential for pro-environmental change. So basically, voting for a party who supports economic growth might actually be something you do in order to change or create a sustainable society. What you also see is that many people believe that parties who, for instance, support very strong environmental goals might be detrimental for the economy, and for that reason might also harm sustainable programs. So it's a bit on how you translate those values into reality, and how you translate those things into certain actions that might determine what you do and what you don't support. So a complete different opinion on a certain topic or a complete different action could actually boil down to the same values. Another thing which is also very obvious, I think, is the value conflicts. And I think also some of the previous relationships related to that, it's not that you care about one thing, you care about many different things. And that also needs to be taken into account when you sort of try to infer, to get an idea about why people take actions. So it might be that someone cares a lot about the environment, but still perceives those costs as just unreasonable, too high, and for that reason also don't perform these actions. So I think also what you mentioned, Lorraine, that many of these things also, the subsidies should be made easier in order to let those motivations shine through. What also often happens is that there's a lack of consideration. I think that also relates a bit to what you were talking, Jeff, about in your talk, is that in many contexts, so for instance, as a manager, it might not be part of, and I think, Maddie, you talked about this as well, in many of those contexts, maybe sustainability is not the thing that's top of mind. It's just something which is there, but not maybe part of your main tasks or the main things that you do at work. So you might care a lot about the environment, but it might simply not be the context to think about it, to consider it when making decisions. Now, another thing which I think also Chinran's dissertation also nicely illustrated is also that people might feel lack of capacity, lack of capabilities of taking these actions. So you might be motivated, but simply think, I can do this within the context I'm in. The main message I want to talk about, and I think that also, well, which I want to convey during this talk, is also that, well, those constraints that we saw on the previous slide, so we have now sort of discussed them as more at an individual level or something that might affect you due to the context we're in, but actually that the cynicism, so the thing that Barry was just talking about, might actually be a very strong cause of many of those barriers. So in 2022, Linda and I published a paper on the spiral of inaction, so you already mentioned the spiral of action in the introduction, but we also focused on the spiral of inaction and actually how sort of the perceptions or the misperceptions we have about people around us, so basically believing that other people don't care, might inhibit us as individuals, as citizens, but also within organizations, so managers, decision makers, but also governments from taking climate action. And actually that many of this, the cynicism might have a very strong influence on many of those barriers that we observe within society. So, for instance, value conflicts might be strengthened by, or might be sort of, might remain there simply because we don't, or the system is not adjusted because people don't see support for this. If you don't think there's support for subsidies or support for traveling by train, governments are not going to initiate action to make it cheaper or to make it easier for people. Lack of consideration, if you don't talk with each other about these kind of things, if you don't interact with each other on these kind of topics, simply because we think other people don't care about these things, we will never know that others care about these things, and we will never share opportunities to act in pro-environmental ways. Well, the same also relates to lack of capacity and capabilities. So maybe to end, what to do with this cynicism. So if this cynicism basically sort of strengthens many of the, or maintains many of the barriers that we have within society, what can we do with this? I think a common approach, and maybe I think your manipulation might also relate to that, is also update people with data. We did that different times. Sometimes it works, quite often it didn't work. And actually quite often people are quite cynical about what you present to them as well. So you might say, well, we found in our data that a certain amount of people is actually supportive of this policy. You don't see people changing that much. Well, you say that I believe something else. I'm quite cynical about what others want. So it might work, and well, you already showed that there are also conditions for when it works and when it doesn't work. So I think that's important to explore. It doesn't always work, and people don't always trust you. Another option might be sort of discussing this cynicism directly, so rather than trying to update their beliefs, maybe also talk about this cynicism and how they might be affected by this, just to open people up to this idea. But also when that works is also a bit more uncertain. Another thing that could work is also let people talk and share about those underlying values. Something I didn't mention earlier, but actually is quite important to mention, is if you look at those different actions, you see quite different opinions on these actions. If you look at the different values, you see that actually a lot of different groups overlap quite substantially in the values that they have. Political left, political right are typically seen as very strong on, so left typically very strong on biospheric, altruistic values, and very weak on self-enhancement, so self-interested values, and the exact opposite applies to the political right. If you look at the actual data, the differences are very subtle and quite small. So actually one of the main ways of bringing people together on these kind of topics and actually make people aware of the values that are shared within society is sort of opening them up to talk about these things. So we have to find ways to stimulate people to talk about where they actually care about, but also why they support or don't support certain actions, because actually the reasons might overlap with each other and might open up more constructive interactions. I think that was it for now. I think I'm also out of time. I hope I didn't go over it. Thank you very much.